Spring set the ballrooms of London ablaze with a nearly feverish brilliance, and Elliot James Hawthorne, 5th Duke of Blackmore, watched the crowd with the gaze of a man searching for an exit he knew did not exist. At 29, he had long since lost count of how many balls he had endured wearing the same carefully rehearsed smile, the same ritual, the same mothers appraising his title with the practical focus of investors examining a prospect. The same debutantes laughing a shade too loudly, scented too richly, hopeful to the point of desperation. Elliot had done his part. He had greeted, danced, inclined his head at the proper moments. And now, with the night still young and the ballroom full, he allowed himself a few moments of stillness by the door that opened onto the garden, an untouched glass of champagne resting between his fingers. That was when he saw her. She had just entered. There was no hesitation in her step. No restless glance searching for familiar faces. She crossed the room with an economy of movement that made him straighten unconsciously. Her brown hair was arranged with elegance and restraint. No feathers, no excessive flowers. It caught the candlelight as though the flames themselves leaned toward her. Her dark blue gown did not compete for attention, and perhaps for that very reason, it stood apart from all the others that begged to be noticed. When her eyes met his, for the briefest moment, something old shifted in Elliot's chest, light brown eyes, almost golden, eyes that seemed to hold far more than they revealed. He knew that rhythm, the pause before answering, the half-smile that never fully surrendered, the slight tilt of her head as she listened to the gentleman beside her, as though every word deserved to be weighed before it earned a reply. Elliot was certain he knew her, though he could not have said from where. He crossed the ballroom before thinking better of it, introduced himself to her father, asked for a dance, and as they waltzed, as they spoke of nothing at all, as he tried to understand why this woman echoed somewhere deep within his memory, she spoke a single word, a word that shifted the world beneath his feet. Dunmore. The name struck Elliot's mind like thunder, and then he understood. The woman in his arms, the woman whose golden eyes now held his with devastating calm, was the same one whose letters lay locked away in a drawer at Blackmore, the same woman whose intelligence had made him wait for the post like a fool, the same woman he had dismissed 8 months earlier with polite, cowardly words, convinced he was sparing her from his own debts. Claire, the woman he had deemed too poor to be his wife, stood before him now, wrapped in an elegance that had nothing to do with her gown, and everything to do with something steady, unshakable, essential. Guilt fell upon him like molten lead. "It was a pleasure meeting you, Your Grace," she said, her politeness flawless. "Thank you for the dance." Then she turned away, leaving him standing in the middle of the ballroom like a pillar of salt, surrounded by music, light, and voices, more alone than he had ever been in his life. The ball had only just begun, and Elliot James Hawthorne was already ruined. If this story touched you, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. It helps these stories find new readers, and it lets me know you'd like to hear more like this. And if you feel like it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I truly love seeing how far these stories travel. 10 months earlier, Claire Eliza Fraser's world had stretched no farther than green hills and quiet corridors on an estate called Dunmore in the Scottish Highlands. The house was not a palace, but no one would have called it modest. 3 stories of grey stone, tall windows that caught the light even on the bleakest days, well-kept stables, and gardens a great-grandmother had designed with careful devotion decades earlier. Dunmore had belonged to a maternal aunt, and it had come to Claire as an inheritance, a gift she accepted with relief, because it meant distance, distance from London, distance from questions, distance from any gaze that tried to calculate her worth by the cut of her gown. At 24, Claire lived exactly as she had chosen to live. There were enough servants to keep the house running smoothly, an estate manager to deal with the tenants, and a governess who pretended not to notice when her employer spent entire afternoons in the library instead of embroidering. It was a comfortable life, orderly, deliberately discreet, and Claire valued every one of those qualities. No one at Dunmore knew the true extent of her fortune, and no one needed to. The Fraser money did not come from ancestral lands, nor from ancient titles. It came from something the British aristocracy preferred to pretend did not exist. Business. Douglas Fraser, her father, had built a quiet empire on the American continent. Coal in Pennsylvania, copper in Michigan, stakes in railways cutting through territories that had yet to earn names on maps. It was new wealth, rich with the scent of earth and risk. Wealth that did not sit comfortably in drawing rooms or polite conversation. For that reason, Douglas had raised his daughter to understand every figure, every contract, every trap hidden in polished clauses. And above all, never to display what she possessed. "Those who speak of money lose control of it," he had told her once. "You don't need to negotiate, Claire. You need to know when they're lying to you." She had learned. She employed managers, accountants, men who signed documents in her name, but none of them would deceive her. Claire read every paper, questioned figures that did not align, and had already dismissed more than one employee who mistook discretion for ignorance. The simplicity of her life was not poverty. It was choice. It was armor. It was into this carefully quiet routine that Helena Hawthorne appeared. Their friendship had begun 2 years earlier, at a charitable gathering in Edinburgh. Helena was everything Claire was not, expansive, eager to please, incapable of holding a thought for more than a few moments. At 19, the sister of the Duke of Blackmore resembled a puppy given human form. Awkward, loyal, and impossible not to like. They became frequent correspondents, exchanging letters about books, about the glorious tedium of the countryside, and about the small absurdities Helena narrated as if they were Greek tragedies. In one of those letters, Claire mentioned a problem. She did not ask for help. She never would have. She merely noted, in between paragraphs about a French novel and the unpredictable Highland weather, that a neighbouring tenant was claiming rights of passage over Dunmore land. Using documents she suspected were forged, her estate manager did not know how to contest the matter without provoking a scandal. Helena read the letter 3 times. She understood barely half of it, and she did what she always did when the world became too complicated. She went to her brother. Chapter 1. A Brother's Duty. 10 months before the ball. Elliot James Hawthorne still believed discipline might be enough to save what remained of Blackmore. The study smelled of old paper and responsibility. Stacks of correspondence crowded the oak desk, supplier invoices, harvest reports that promised less than was needed, and a letter from the family solicitor he had avoided opening for 4 days. Beyond the window, the gardens of Blackmore Hall stretched out in impeccable green, sustaining the illusion of prosperity that the ledgers dismantled, page by page. The dukedom was dying, not dramatically. There were no creditors at the door. No immediate threats, but Elliot knew the numbers too well to deceive himself. His grandfather had squandered fortunes on horses and wagers, his father on grand renovations, and on a French mistress who had cost more than both combined. Now, at 29, Elliot had inherited an illustrious title, a magnificent estate, and a debt that grew with every season. Quiet, relentless. He had not slept well for months. Not that anyone noticed. A duke does not show weakness. A duke resolves. Elliot had cut expenses where he could, negotiated extensions, sold 7 thoroughbreds, and a collection of watches his grandfather had amassed out of vanity. He had bought time, but time did not pay debts, and Elliot knew, with the uncomfortable clarity of a man who had run every calculation, that there was only one real solution. He needed to marry money. The idea revolted him, not marriage itself. Elliot had never been romantic enough to expect love, but the transaction it implied. Offering the title in exchange for a fortune, turning himself into a commodity. It was what society expected, what logic demanded, what any sensible man in his position would do without hesitation. And yet, Elliot hesitated. It was in that state, exhausted, bitter, buried in papers, that Helena entered without knocking. "Elliot, I need your help." He did not look up. "Not now." "You don't even know what it is." "I don't need to." He signed a document and reached for the next. "I'm busy, Helena." His sister ignored the refusal the way she ignored anything that struck her as inconvenient. She crossed the study with determined steps, rounded the desk, and placed a letter before him with the exaggerated solemnity of someone presenting a peace treaty. "It's from my friend Claire from Scotland," she said in a single breath. "She has a problem with land and documents, and I didn't understand half of it, but it sounds serious. And I don't know what to reply. And you understand these things, and—" "Helena, please." She clasped her hands theatrically. "I just need you to read it. If it's nonsense, I'll answer myself." Elliot finally looked at her. Helena was 19, light brown hair that escaped its pins as though it had a will of its own, blue eyes that had not yet learned to conceal anything. She wore a pale yellow dress that suited her nature, too cheerful, too trusting. Impossible to ignore, she was everything Elliot could not afford to be. And yet, she was the only reason he smiled at all. "One letter," he said, taking the paper. "One. Then you let me work." Helena nodded with excessive enthusiasm. The handwriting was the first surprise. Precise, controlled. Each letter formed with the economy of someone who wasted neither ink nor time. Elliot had expected the rounded, careless script of Helena's friends. What he found looked closer to a legal brief than to correspondence between young women. The content was the second surprise. Claire Fraser described a dispute over rights of way with a neighbouring tenant. Old documents had been produced, supposedly signed by an ancestor, but she noted inconsistencies, dates that did not align with public records, a signature that varied too greatly from other examples of the same period. Her estate manager did not know how to proceed without turning the matter into a scandal. There was no plea, no dramatics, only facts, flaws, and a quiet expectation of an answer. Elliot read the letter twice. "Who is this woman?" he asked. "Claire Fraser. I met her in Edinburgh at a charity event," Helena said. "She's different." She tilted her head, searching for the word. "She doesn't speak much, but when she does, you listen. She lives alone on a family property." "Alone?" "An aunt left her the house. Dunmore, I think, up north. And her family. Her father travels a great deal. Business, from what I understand. She never says much about it." Elliot's gaze returned to the letter. A young woman living alone on an inherited estate. An absent father. An inept manager. The picture suggested modest means. Rural gentry, perhaps less. The sort London ignored without effort. And yet, the analysis of the documents was impeccable. "I'll reply for you," he said at last, "but I'll sign your name." "Of course!" Helena was already smiling. "Thank you, Elliot. You're the best brother in the world. I'm your only brother." "That doesn't change anything." She leaned in and kissed his forehead before he could protest. Then she was gone, leaving behind the faint scent of lavender and a silence that seemed heavier than before. Elliot remained still. The letter lay on the desk. He picked it up again, ran his fingers over the firm handwriting, and without quite knowing why, slid it into a drawer instead of discarding it. That night, after the house had gone to sleep, he sat at the desk in his bedroom and wrote the reply. It was brief, formal. He explained the procedures for contesting fraudulent documents in property disputes, suggested the appropriate type of solicitor, listed the records that would need to be verified. He signed Helena's name as agreed and sealed the envelope without rereading it. It was a favour to his sister, nothing more. But when Claire Fraser's response arrived at Blackmore 3 weeks later, Elliot intercepted the post before breakfast. He opened the letter alone, in the study. The door locked, and for the first time in months, he forgot about the debts. Chapter 2. An unfamiliar hand. The reply reached Dunmore on a morning of fine rain, when the Scottish sky seemed unable to decide between grey and black. Claire was in the library when the governess brought the post. 3 letters, arranged on a silver tray, ordered by their arrival. 2 were predictable. A report from the accountant in Edinburgh, and a note from her father, informing her he would remain in Boston until autumn. The 3rd bore the Hawthorne seal. Helena, At last. Claire settled into the armchair by the window, her chair upholstered in dark green velvet, which no servant dared move, and opened the envelope without haste. She expected Helena's effusive tone, the breathless accounts, the questions piling up without waiting for answers. Helena wrote as she spoke, in a rush, pouring enthusiasm onto the page, but the letter in her hands was not a rush. It was a dam. Claire frowned and reread the opening lines. The handwriting was different, more angular, more restrained. Each letter formed with almost austere precision. There were no affectionate greetings, no asides, no attempt at charm, only a methodical analysis of the problem she had described, followed by clear instructions on how to proceed. The objection must be formally registered with the County Property Office, accompanied by certified copies of Dunmore's original records. I also recommend requesting the signature ledgers from the relevant period. If the forgery is as evident as you suggest, a comparison of hands should suffice to resolve the matter without the need for prolonged litigation. Claire read the paragraph more than once. Helena did not know what a county property office was. Helena believed graphology had something to do with astrology. Helena, for all her disorganized sweetness, could not have written a sentence like that under threat of death. Someone had answered for her. Claire's gaze dropped to the signature, Helena Hawthorne, written in letters that attempted to mimic her friend's hand, and failed in an almost embarrassing way. The H was too rigid. The A closed where it should have opened. The final flourish, at which Helena always exaggerated, appeared restrained, as though the writer had decided not to allow excess. Whoever it was had not bothered to practice the forgery, or had not thought it necessary. She ought to have been irritated. The correspondence was private, the matter her own. Helena had no right to share another person's affairs with a third party, least of all someone who had not even signed his own name. That alone justified a brief, cold, definitive reply. But irritation did not come. Instead, Claire read the letter again, more carefully now, lingering over the choice of words. As evident as you suggest, not claim, not assert, suggest. Whoever had written believed her. He had accepted her assessment without condescension, without the instructive tone men so often adopted when women ventured into legal matters. There were no unnecessary explanations, no hollow compliments, no excessive caution. There was respect and competence, and a restraint Claire recognized, because she practiced it daily. This man measured words the way she measured words. He did not waste them. Who was he? The answer came easily enough. Helena had only one close male relative, her elder brother, the Duke of Blackmore, an ancient title, a vast estate in the north of England, and, according to Helena herself, a seriousness that bordered on the unbearable. Elliot thinks smiling is a waste of energy, Helena had written once. He spends his days buried in papers and responsibilities. Sometimes I think he might break in too, but he never complains. At the time, Claire had imagined a rigid, distant man. Now, for not with the letter open beside her, she was no longer so certain. There was something here that did not align with the image she had built. Claire went to the writing desk, pushed the papers aside, drew out a blank sheet. Beyond the window, the rain had thickened, turning the garden into indistinct washes of green and grey. The fire crackled in the hearth. The house was quiet, the sort of quiet she had always prized. Yet now, it felt weighted, almost expectant. The pen hovered above the inkwell. She could offer a brief thanks and close the matter. It was the sensible path, the safe path, the path that kept strangers at a distance. But the letter was still there. She dipped the pen and began to write. She did not thank him. She challenged one of his suggestions, politely but without softening the argument. The deadline he had cited did not apply under Scottish law. Claire explained why. She added a detail he had not considered. The tenant had a relative in the local registry office, which required additional caution. And at the end, she wrote something that had nothing to do with rights of way. Miss Hawthorne once mentioned that Blackmore possesses one of the most complete libraries in the north of England. I wonder whether the collection includes treatises on Scottish rural law. Those in my possession are out of date by at least 2 decades. It was a test. If Helena replied, the true Helena with her rounded script and her absolute ignorance of anything involving law, Claire would know her brother had stepped away. The pretense would end. But if the reply came in the same angular hand, with the same precision, with the same measured respect, Claire did not finish the thought. She sealed the letter with green wax, summoned a servant, and sent it to the post before she could reconsider. Then she returned to the armchair by the window, opened a book she did not intend to read, and watched the rain trace paths down the glass. She was not waiting. She was simply attentive. 3 weeks was a long time for a reply. 3 weeks would be an eternity. Chapter 3. The Pleasure of Being Contradicted. Claire Fraser's letter reached Blackmore on an afternoon of pale sunlight. By then, Elliot had already given up waiting. 3 weeks, 21 days of checking the post with an anxiety he refused to name. He told himself it was professional curiosity. The woman had challenged his deadline, and he wanted to see whether she would have the courage to concede. He told himself it was boredom. The accounts and reports dulled the mind, and any distraction was welcome. He repeated the justifications so often that he nearly believed a few of them. But when he saw the envelope on the tray, bearing the precise handwriting he now recognized at a distance, something tightened in his chest. And it had nothing to do with curiosity or boredom. He took the letter to the study, locked the door, sat in the armchair by the window, not the chair behind the desk where he worked, the armchair where he read for pleasure. Only then did he break the seal. Green wax, no crest, no initials. The woman did not display, even in her correspondence. The first line made him smile. Miss Hawthorne was kind enough to reply so promptly, though I note that her handwriting has undergone some curious changes since our last exchange. Perhaps the English climate affects the steadiness of the hand. She knew. Elliot reread the paragraph. Slowly. There was no accusation. There was irony. Claire Fraser did not seem offended that he had intruded upon her correspondence. She seemed amused by it, and at the same time, by not confronting him outright, she offered him an elegant exit. A chance to retreat without embarrassment. It was a kindness. Elliot had no intention of accepting it. He read on. Her challenge to the deadline followed immediately. Grounded, precise, infuriatingly correct. Scottish law differed from English law in ways he had not known, and she not only identified the error, she explained the historical reason behind the distinction. There was no condescension, no triumph, only clarity. When had anyone last corrected him like that? His peers agreed out of convenience, his subordinates out of hierarchy. Helena agreed because disagreement required an effort she rarely sustained for more than 2 minutes. And the young women presented to him as prospective wives agreed before he finished speaking. Claire Fraser did not agree. Claire Fraser was right, and felt no need whatsoever to disguise it. The third paragraph complicated matters further. The tenant's cousin in the local registry altered the landscape entirely. Elliot frowned, calculating the implications, higher costs, longer timelines, more delicate strategies. She had identified the problem before he had. Again, who in God's name was this woman? The question lingered through the final paragraph. Her inquiry about Blackmore's library seemed at first glance practical, innocent, but Elliot recognized the trap immediately. If he replied as Helena, he would have to feign knowledge his sister did not possess. If he ignored the question, the ruse would be exposed, and if he replied as himself, he would confess everything. Elliot sat in silence. The letter rested against his knee. Golden light spilled through the window. The clock on the mantel marked the hours with merciless precision. Somewhere in the house Helena laughed, a loud, generous laugh, impossible to contain, as though the world were still simple. He thought of London's ballrooms, of rehearsed smiles, of empty conversations, of the fortunes he needed to court to save Blackmore. He thought of the burden he carried alone, not the numbers. Any clerk could review those, but the constant exhaustion of pretending control. and he thought of that woman in Scotland, living alone on an inherited estate, facing dishonest neighbours without asking for help, writing letters as one might wield a foil, without waste, without hesitation, a woman who did not need him. The thought was unexpectedly liberating. Elliot pushed the reports aside, drew paper and pen toward him. He did not plan the text. He did not calculate each sentence. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to write without strategy. Miss Fraser. He abandoned Helena's name without explanation, as though the ruse had never existed. You are correct regarding the deadline, and I was mistaken. It is a sufficiently rare experience that I acknowledge it without reservation. As for the cousin at the registry, the matter requires an approach different from the one I suggested, and I ask leave to propose an alternative. He wrote for an hour, then another. The sun moved across the sky. Shadows lengthened along the floor. The reports remained untouched. A servant knocked to announce dinner. Elliot dismissed him without looking up. When he finished, the letter ran to 4 pages. 4 pages on Scottish law, property records, strategies of contestation. But also, between the technical lines discreet as contraband, questions that had nothing to do with rights of way. About the books she read, about the silence of the Highlands, about what led a woman to choose solitude, when the world expected her to choose a husband. Elliot reread the letter. It was too intimate, too imprudent. A duke did not write like this to a stranger. A duke kept his distance, especially from women of no apparent fortune, women who could not save him, women who would only bring complications. He should have torn it to pieces. Instead, he poured black wax over the fold, pressed the hawthorn seal into it, and summoned a servant to send it to the post the following morning. That night, for the first time in months, Elliot slept without dreaming of debts. He dreamed of precise handwriting, and of a pair of eyes he had never seen, but imagined golden, because someone who wrote with such clarity could only have eyes the colour of the sun. Chapter 4. The True Name. The letter arrived on a fog-bound morning, a morning when Dunmore seemed to float between sky and earth like a lost ship. Claire noticed the envelope on the breakfast tray before she even sat down. The hawthorn seal was unmistakable, the eagle on a black field, wings spread in eternal flight. But it was the handwriting that stopped her. The teacup hovered inches from her lips. It was not Helena's hand, nor even an attempt to imitate it. It was his, deliberately, unapologetically. Claire dismissed the governess with a distracted gesture and carried the letter to the library. Her footsteps echoed through the empty corridors as the fog thickened against the windows, like a secret determined to linger. She sat in the green velvet armchair, smoothed her skirts with the automatic care imposed by years of discipline, and only then did she break the seal. Black wax, the hawthorn signet, official, intentional. Miss Fraser, the letter began. Without Helena's name, without pretense, without any attempt at disguise. You are correct regarding the deadline, and I was mistaken. Claire read the sentence 3 times, a duke admitting error, to a woman he had never met, in writing. The vulnerability was so unexpected it bordered on indecency, like walking in on someone half-dressed without warning. But he did not stop there. The 4 pages that followed were a map of his mind. Elliot Hawthorne, because now she could think of him by name, because now he had offered it. He laid out a new strategy for the land dispute, detailed, precise. He explained why the initial approach would fail under the influence of the cousin at the registry, proposed elevating the matter to the Edinburgh courts, bypassing local power altogether. Every argument was solid, every step logical, and at no point did he write as though she required simplification. He wrote to her as an equal. Claire could not remember the last time anyone had done so. Her father respected her, but as one respects an extension of oneself, a successful investment. The estate managers obeyed her, and obedience was not respect. The few men who had attempted to court her over the years treated her with the empty deference reserved for expensive furniture. Admiration for form, indifference to substance. Elliot Hawthorne, without ever seeing her, wrote as though substance were all that mattered. And then, in the final pages, the letter changed. The technical lines gave way to questions that had nothing to do with properties or documents, about the book she had mentioned wishing to find, about the silence of the highlands, and whether solitude could exist amid so much quiet, about what led a woman to choose such a life, far from ballrooms, far from expectations, far from what society insisted on calling success. "I do not ask in judgment," he had written. "I ask because I cannot imagine it. My life is made of obligations I did not choose, and of people who expect things I am not certain I can give. You appear to have found something I am still seeking. The freedom to be exactly who one is, without witnesses demanding performance." Claire lowered the letter. Beyond the window, the fog was beginning to thin, revealing fragments of the garden, the lavender beds, the stone wall, the ancient oak her aunt had planted decades earlier. Everything familiar, everything safe, everything exactly as she had chosen. And yet, for the first time, that safety felt less comfortable. Who was this man? Helena's letters painted an incomplete portrait: the serious brother, the overburdened duke, the man who carried his family's weight without complaint. But the words before her suggested layers Helena herself might never have noticed: weariness, loneliness, and a restrained honesty that was almost dangerous. Claire rose and went to the window, pressed her palm against the cold glass, watched the fog retreat, slow, measured, like an army in withdrawal. She should keep her distance. That was the sensible answer, the prudent one, the one 24 years of training demanded. Elliot Hawthorne was a duke, a title surrounded by expectations, responsibilities, a future written long before his birth. She was an heiress who pretended not to be, a woman who had chosen anonymity as armor. There was no future here, perhaps not even a present, only words on paper, crossing hundreds of miles, creating an intimacy that should not exist. But the letter remained on the armchair, open, not as provocation, but as invitation, and Claire already knew she would reply. She sat at the writing desk when the sun finally broke through the fog. The pen moved across the page with less hesitation than she expected. She began with the technical matters, safe ground, familiar ground. She agreed with the strategy, added observations about the Edinburgh courts, judges whose rigor she knew by reputation, procedures she had followed from a careful distance, and then, without planning to, she answered the other questions. "You ask about solitude, I will be honest. It is not solitude I feel here. It is silence, and silence is different. Solitude is the absence of what is necessary. Silence is the presence of enough space to hear one's own thoughts." She paused. Read what she had written. It was more than she should say, more than she had ever said to anyone. She continued nonetheless. "Chosen silence is freedom. Imposed silence is a prison. And sometimes, only sometimes, I am not certain which of the two I inhabit." The letter ended with a question she had not intended to ask. "You mentioned obligations you did not choose. Have you ever considered what you would do if you could choose?" Claire sealed the envelope before she could reconsider, poured green wax over the fold, her color, her invisible seal, her small rebellion against a world that demanded coats of arms. She summoned a servant, sent the letter, and spent the rest of the day unable to focus on anything, except the question she had asked, and the new unsettling fear that he might actually answer it. Chapter 5. What he would do if he could choose. Claire Fraser's question haunted Elliot for 3 days before he could face it. "You mentioned obligations you did not choose. Have you ever considered what you would do if you could choose?" The letter had arrived on an ordinary morning, mixed in with harvest reports and an invitation to a London dinner he had no intention of attending. Elliot read it in the study, as always. The door locked, the world held at bay. Her notes about the Edinburgh courts were precise, her observations about the judges useful, Everything exactly as he had expected. Until the question. He reread it so many times that the words ceased to be words. They became incisions, clean cuts into something he kept carefully sealed. What would you do if you could choose? As though choice were a luxury available to men like him. As though the title he bore did not come bound to centuries of expectation, inherited debts, a name that had to endure, even when it threatened to crush the man who carried it. Elliot did not answer because he did not know what to say. No, that was a lie. He did not answer because he knew exactly what he would say, and the truth was far too dangerous to commit to paper. On the third day, Helena found him in the garden. It was a late summer afternoon. The sun still warm enough to justify a walk among the beds their mother had planted before she died. Elliot was not walking. He stood before the stone bench where he had sat as a child, staring at nothing in particular. The letter folded in his coat pocket like a secret that refused to release him. "You're acting strangely," Helena said, stopping beside him. "Your imagination." "No," she crossed her arms. "You've been strange for weeks, since you started answering Claire's letters." Elliot turned. Helena met his gaze, 19 years old, hair loose in the wind, an unusual attentiveness in her face. "You know." It was not a question. "Of course I know." She rolled her eyes. "I recognized it by the second letter, maybe the first, when I saw my name on the envelope before the footman took it to the post. And you said nothing. Why would I?" She shrugged, but the gesture was not light. "You were different, less heavy." She hesitated. "I haven't seen you like that since before Father died." Their father's name hung between them, dense, unavoidable. "Helena, you don't have to explain." She touched his arm, brief, careful. "I just want to know one thing." She looked at him steadily. "Do you like her?" The question was simple. The answer, impossible. Elliot looked away, toward the garden, their mother's rose bushes, the stone wall that needed repairs he could not afford, the house behind them, with its tall windows and generational secrets. All of it was his. All of it depended on him. And somewhere in Scotland, a woman he had never seen was waiting for an answer he did not have the courage to give. "It doesn't matter," he said at last. "It does. She has no fortune, Helena." His voice was dry, controlled. "She lives on a rural inheritance, no significant connections." He drew a breath. You know what I need. A wealthy wife." "Yes." He did not soften it. "I need a wealthy wife." "Then why do you keep writing to her?" Elliot did not answer. Helena was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. "I met Claire 2 years ago. She is the most intelligent person I've ever known." She hesitated. "And also the loneliest. Not lonely like you, surrounded by duties and ancient walls. Truly lonely. Like someone who built a wall around herself and forgot where the door was." She drew a breath. "But in the letters she sends me now, Elliot, she mentions you, not by name, but I know. She asks about the brother who carries everything without complaint. She asks in a way that isn't curiosity." His chest tightened. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that for the first time since I've known her, Claire Fraser seems to be looking for the door." Helena did not wait for a reply. She squeezed his arm once more and went back toward the house, leaving him alone with everything he could not say aloud. That night, Elliot locked himself in the study and finally answered. He began with what was safe: courts, documents, solicitors, 2 pages of technical content, every sentence measured, every word in its place. Then he stopped, the pen hovering, the fire crackling low, the clock marking a time he did not wish to hear. "You asked what I would do if I could choose." He wrote before prudence could stop him. "I would choose not to be afraid. Afraid of disappointing the dead who built what I inherited. Afraid of failing the living who depend on me. Afraid of wanting what I cannot have, because wanting is to admit that duty is not enough. You wrote about chosen silence and imposed silence. I inhabit something else. It is not silence. It is noise. The voices of past generations telling me who I must be, what I must preserve, whom I must marry. But when I read your letters, He noise stops. For a few minutes I am only a man writing to a woman. Not a duke, not a title. I do not know what to do with this, but I thought you should know. Elliot reread the letter. It was too much, too intimate, a confession no man in his position should ever make. She might ignore it, she might never reply, and her silence would be final. He should have torn the paper apart. Instead, he sealed the envelope with black wax. He slept without sending it. The next morning, before reason fully woke, he carried the letter to the post tray himself. 3 weeks later, Claire's reply arrived, and nothing was simple again. Chapter 6. Noise and Silence. The letter arrived on a frosted morning, a morning when winter had finally decided to settle over Dunmore. Claire found it on the breakfast tray, between a note from the estate manager and an invitation to tea in Edinburgh she had no intention of accepting. The hawthorn black seal was familiar now. She recognized the precise weight of the paper in her hands, the angular handwriting visible through the envelope, the particular way her heart misbehaved at the sight of it. But something was different. The seal seemed pressed with less certainty than usual, the wax slightly uneven, as though the hands that had sealed the letter had not been as steady as before. Claire carried the envelope to the library. She sat in the green velvet armchair, as always. Broke the seal with the silver letter opener that had belonged to her aunt, as always. Nothing that followed was as always. The first pages were familiar, technical observations, precise notes on legal procedures, a dry remark about an Edinburgh judge whose reputation he questioned. Claire read with the quiet pleasure of someone walking a known path, savouring each sentence like firm steps on stable ground. Then she reached the final page. "You asked what I would do if I could choose." Claire stopped breathing. "I would choose not to be afraid." What followed was an exposed fracture, fear of disappointing the dead, fear of failing the living, fear of wanting what he could not have. Each sentence stripped away another layer of armour, and Claire read with the unsettling sensation of witnessing something too intimate, too true, something she might not have been meant to see. "But when I read your letters, Miss Fraser, the noise stops." She lowered the paper. Beyond the window, the first snow of the season covered the garden, erasing tracks, softening edges, turning Dunmore into something almost unreal. The fire in the hearth crackled low. Somewhere in the house the governess gave orders to the servants, the distant murmur of voices, a reminder that the world still existed, but it felt distant now, terribly distant. He had not spoken of love. He had written nothing that could be repeated in a drawing room, nothing that could be quoted in public. And yet it was more honest than any declaration, because Elliot Hawthorne, Duke of Blackmore, had just admitted that only she could quiet something that consumed him. Not her appearance, which he had never seen, not her position, which she concealed so carefully. Only her words, only her mind, only what she chose to reveal in ink and paper. And it was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever said to her. Claire rose and went to the window. She pressed her palm against the cold glass, watched the snow fall, slow, steady, covering everything that had existed before. The noise he described was not unfamiliar to her. Ancient voices, inherited expectations, an imposed future. She knew it, in another form. A father who trained her to distrust, a society that would judge her by the husband she chose. The mask she had learned to wear so early that she sometimes forgot what her true face was. Different prisons, still prisons, and now, for the first time, someone was reaching through the bars, not to free her, but to say, "I am imprisoned too." Claire returned to the writing desk. She sat. The pen hovered for a long moment. How did one answer something like that, without confessing in return? The fire popped softly. The snow thickened outside. The silence of the house seemed to hold its breath. The pen touched the paper. Elliot. His name, for the first time. Without title. Without protection. Just the name she had repeated in silence more often than she would admit. I read your letter 3 times before I could breathe. It was true. She continued. You ask what to do with the silence you find in my words. I ask myself the same, because when your letters arrive, Dunmore feels less empty. I do not know when this began. I do not know how to undo it. I do not know if I wish to. The next paragraph came more slowly, each sentence a careful step over thin ice. You said you would choose not to be afraid. I would choose that as well, but perhaps fear is what keeps us intact. The line between what we desire and what we can endure. If I cross that line, Elliot, I do not know if I can return. The final sentence escaped her before she could stop it. And you? Could you? Claire reread the letter in its entirety. It was too much. A surrender disguised as a question. The offering of something precious, with no guarantee it would be protected rather than broken. She thought of tearing it up, of rewriting something safer. Instead, she folded the paper, sealed it with green wax, and summoned a servant before reason could catch her. The letter left that very afternoon. Claire remained in the library until the fire burned low, watching the snow gather on the windowsill, wondering whether she had just opened a door or deliberately chosen to stand on the other side of it. Chapter 7. The Point of No Return. Claire's reply reached Blackmore when winter had already wrapped the north of England in a white mantle of silence. Elliot was waiting for it. He would never admit that aloud, would not admit it even to himself. But in recent days, he had begun checking the post tray before breakfast, inventing excuses to cross the hall when the courier arrived. Waking before dawn with an anxiety wholly unbecoming of a 29-year-old duke, 6 months of letters, 6 months of words crossing the border between England and Scotland, and at some point, he could not have said when, it had ceased to be correspondence. It had become something nameless, something that did not fit within duty or prudence, something that frightened him. The letter lay on the desk when he entered the study. The green seal, always green, never bearing a crest, never initials, felt like a silent challenge. Elliot locked the door before opening it. Elliot, his name, without title, without armor. 5 letters capable of undoing years of discipline with the gentleness of a touch. He read the letter standing, unable to sit, unable to breathe properly. Each sentence advanced a careful step toward him, measured, restrained, and yet irrevocable. When your letters arrive, Dunmore feels less empty. I do not know when this began. I do not know how to undo it. I do not know if I wish to. And then the question, simple, devastating. If I cross that line, Elliot, I do not know if I can return. And you? Could you? He lowered the paper. No, he could not. The truth imposed itself with cruel clarity. He had already crossed the line, perhaps weeks earlier. Perhaps from the very first letter in which she had corrected him without mercy and without condescension. What held him at Blackmore was not choice. It was constraint, money. The word was ugly, unworthy of what he felt. And yet, it was the only honest one. Claire Fraser lived comfortably, discreetly, autonomously. Everything about her spoke of restraint, not abundance. Nothing suggested the resources he so desperately required. The traveling father. The vaguely mentioned business interests, the complete absence of display, all pointed to a fortune that did not exist, at least not in the eyes of a man trying to save a dukedom. And Blackmore needed saving, not out of vanity, not out of pride, but because it was not his alone. It belonged to the tenants, the servants, to Helena, to a name that had survived centuries and now threatened to crumble under his watch. A marriage to Claire would not be a scandal. It would be worse, slow. Silent, irreversible. Elliot went to the window. The garden lay buried beneath snow, white upon white, like a blank page demanding a decision. If he continued, he would be dishonest. If he wrote again, he would be feeding a hope he could not sustain. He would be using Claire as refuge, while seeking another woman to save the dukedom. That, truly, would be cruelty. The decision formed before he could retreat. He sat at the desk, took up paper and pen. His hand trembled. He ignored it. "Miss Fraser," he wrote, and the formal address was an act of violence against himself. "I received your letter with the consideration it deserves. It is precisely because of that consideration that I write to you now." He paused, then continued. "You asked whether I could return should I cross the line that separates us. The answer is no, I could not. And for that reason, I must stop before crossing it. There are realities I did not choose, yet cannot deny. The dukedom demands things of me that do not belong in letters. It would be unjust to allow you to believe in a future I cannot offer. You deserve more than words on paper. I, regrettably, cannot be that man." Each sentence was true, and yet incomplete. "Please do not see this as indifference. On the contrary, it is precisely because I esteem you that I withdraw now, while I am still able to do so with dignity. I wish you all the happiness you deserve, and I thank you for these months of correspondence. They were, without exaggeration, the most valuable of my life. Respectfully, Elliot James Hawthorne, Duke of Blackmore." He signed with the title deliberately, to remind himself and her of what would always stand between them. He reread the letter 3 times. He wanted to tear it apart. He wanted to throw it into the fire. He wanted to write the naked truth. "I chose you, and it is not enough." He did not. He folded the paper, sealed it with black wax, pressed the Hawthorne signet hard enough to hurt. The next morning, the letter left for Scotland, and Elliot remained behind, seated in the study, watching the fire die slowly, certain that he had done the right thing, and knowing with absolute clarity that doing so did not make the loss any less complete. Chapter 8. The silence that remained. Claire found the letter on the tea tray. Her heart quickened, as it always did when she recognized the Hawthorne black seal. But something was different. The envelope felt thinner than usual, lighter, as though it held fewer words, or words that carried weight in another way. She waited until she was alone in the library before opening it. The first line made her frown. Miss Fraser. Not Claire. Not the name she had offered as one offers the key to a locked door. Miss Fraser. Formal. Distant. Irretrievable. As though the past weeks had never existed. As though she were merely another proper woman from the north. Claire read on. The cold began in her stomach, before she reached the end of the first paragraph. It rose slowly, through her chest, her throat, until it reached the place behind her eyes. Burning, without producing tears. She knew that tone. She knew that construction of sentences, polite words arranged to soften blows. She had seen them before, in lawyers' letters, in business correspondence announcing failures. She had never imagined receiving them from Elliot. He wrote of realities, of obligations, of demands the dukedom placed upon him, things that did not belong in letters. Every sentence was too polished, deliberately vague. Kind, in the way only well-intentioned cruelty can be. Then came the sentence. You deserve someone who can offer more than words on paper. I, regrettably, am not that man. Claire stopped reading. She stared at the line, until the letters lost meaning, until they became nothing more than ink stains on fine paper. The fire crackled in the hearth. Outside, the wind threaded through bare branches. Everything in Dunmore remained unchanged. The furniture, the books, the familiar scent of wood and wax. But something had shifted. It was not her heart. That would have been too simple, too romantic. What had broken lay deeper. The part of her that had begun to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, she would not have to spend her entire life alone. He had not said it outright. Elliot would never do that. But Claire had learned early how to read what was left unsaid. Her father had trained her. Contracts had disciplined her. The truth was there, stitched between the lines with the precision of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. She read the sentence again. The third time, they were no longer words, only shapes. The fourth time, she folded the letter. She did not cry. It was not that kind of pain. It was like discovering that a door you had been walking through in your mind had never truly been open, like realizing that the house where you felt safe had never been yours. In silence, Claire folded the paper. She opened the mahogany box where she kept the others, 17 envelopes, aligned with care, bound by a green ribbon she herself had cut weeks earlier, when she still believed there would be more. She placed the 18th on top, closed the lid. The click of the lock sounded far too loud in the quiet of the library. She put the key away, and remained seated in the green velvet armchair until the light disappeared entirely, without lighting candles, without calling servants, without doing anything beyond breathing, because breathing in that moment already required effort. The weeks that followed passed like a thick fog. She kept to her routines, oversaw the household, replied to Helena's letters without mentioning her brother, and Helena, with unexpected delicacy, did not mention him either. It was as though he had been carefully removed from the world. The legal dispute with the tenant was resolved in February, exactly as Elliot had predicted. Claire signed the papers, thanked the solicitor, returned to Dunmore bearing the weight of a victory she could not feel. It was within that silence that her father's letter arrived. At the beginning of March, Douglas Fraser wrote rarely. He preferred telegrams, figures, decisions. But this time the envelope was thick, the handwriting more deliberate. I have returned from America and require you in London. Come as soon as you are able. London. The word belonged to another life. A place of ballrooms, of unavoidable encounters, of names that never vanish entirely. Claire did not want to go, but her father did not ask. He summoned, and she, despite everything, was still Douglas Fraser's daughter. She packed in silence, left instructions for the governess, did not look back when the carriage departed. Dunmore fell away behind her, covered by the last remnants of snow, and inside a locked drawer, a mahogany box held 18 letters. Proof of something that had existed only on paper, and yet had been far too real to be forgotten. Chapter 9. The Weight of the Name. Spring arrived in London like a promise Elliot had never asked for. Gardens bloomed, ballrooms reopened, mothers of debutantes sharpened their strategies like generals preparing for war, and he, Elliot James Hawthorne, 5th Duke of Blackmore, was the favoured target of them all. 2 months had passed since he had sent the letter to Dunmore, 2 months of silence. Claire had not replied, not a single line, not a word. Not even a cold note demanding explanation, only emptiness, absolute, final, exactly as he had planned. It was what he wanted, what he needed. He had severed the bond before it became impossible to break, and now he could move forward with the clean conscience of a man who believed he had done the right thing. Then why did he wake every night thinking of her? Why did he check the post every morning, knowing full well there would be nothing? Why in every ballroom he crossed did his gaze instinctively search for a pair of light brown eyes he had never seen, yet imagined golden, like light filtered through honey? Elliot had no answers, only the weight of his title, and the expectations that came with it. You must choose soon. His aunt's voice cut through the silence of the study like a sharpened blade. Elliot had not heard her enter. Lady Margaret Hawthorne sat in the armchair by the window, her posture impeccable, shaped by more than 50 years of aristocratic life, grey hair drawn into a severe chignon, eyes blue like his mother's, far too attentive to allow escape. "Choose what, exactly?" he asked. He did not lift his gaze from the papers he pretended to read. A wife. She spoke the word as one presents an unavoidable solution. The season has begun. The most suitable candidates will not wait indefinitely. The most suitable candidates, Elliot repeated, without emotion. Like mares at auction. Don't be vulgar. Margaret folded her hands in her lap. You know precisely what I mean. Lady Arabella Ashby is perfectly appropriate. Her father's fortune would clear the debts, and still allow for renovations to the East Wing. Her mother has approached me twice already. Elliot finally looked up. Lady Arabella Ashby. He knew her. Everyone did. 20 years old, fair-haired, a laugh too loud for enclosed rooms. Her father owned coal mines in Wales. Spent money with the urgency of a man trying to purchase what birth had denied him. Arabella would make a competent duchess, an efficient hostess, a proper wife, and Elliot could not imagine her without feeling a dry hollowness in his chest. "I will consider it," he said, returning to his papers. "You have been saying that for 3 seasons, and I will continue to say it until there is something to consider." Margaret remained silent for a moment longer. When she spoke again, the rigidity had softened. "Elliot." He did not answer. "I know you don't want this. I know you would prefer—" She hesitated. "Something different. But you are the Duke. You do not have the luxury of wanting." "I know what I am, Aunt." "Then act accordingly." She rose, smoothed her skirts with precise movements. "Lady Ashby will be at the Waverley Ball tomorrow. Dance with her. Speak to her. Show intention. You needn't propose just yet, but you must begin." She left before he could reply. The study fell silent. Elliot dropped the papers he had not read, walked to the window. Outside, London churned with the energy of spring. Carriages threading narrow streets, voices blending together, ladies strolling beneath excessive hats. It was a living city, and he had never felt more confined. He thought of Claire, of the letters locked away in a drawer, 18 of them, counted one by one, bound with a cord he himself had tied. He thought of the restrained handwriting, precise, unsparing. He thought of the silence he had left behind, of the emptiness he had created with his own hands. "You deserve someone who can offer more than words on paper." He had written that, believed it, convinced himself it was honor, not cowardice. But what if he were wrong? What if what she deserved was not money, nor titles, nor material security, but someone who chose her above all else? The thought burned like an ember. Elliot pushed it away at once. He could not think that way, could not allow it. Claire Fraser was in Scotland, living her life at Dunmore, likely already forgetting him, if she had not done so already, and he was in London, with a bleeding dukedom, and a future negotiated like a contract. That was how things worked. That was how they had always worked. The following morning, Elliot sent his card to the Ashby residence, confirming his attendance at the ball. The words were chosen with care, polite, proper, promising nothing beyond courtesy. It was the first step toward a life he did not want, with a woman he did not love, in a future that felt more like a prison than a promise. But dukes did not have choices. Dukes had duties. And Elliot Hawthorne, painful as it was, still knew exactly what his was. Chapter 10. Douglas Fraser's Daughter. London was exactly as Claire remembered it, loud, grey, and full of people pretending not to watch. The streets always seemed hurried, even when no one appeared truly in a rush. Carriages fought for space with pedestrians. Vendors called out their wares in voices trained to cut through the constant din, and eyes assessed everything that passed: clothes, posture, companions. London never forgot to see, even when it pretended not to notice. The house her father had rented stood in Mayfair, discreet enough not to draw attention, elegant enough not to invite suspicion. 3 stories of dark brick, tall windows framed by pale curtains, a back garden no one ever used. It was the sort of residence men of capital chose, when they needed to be in London without appearing eager to impress. And Douglas Fraser was not trying to impress anyone. At 58, he was a broad-shouldered man, with rough hands no glove could fully disguise. His hair, once brown like his daughter's, had yielded to grey without resistance. His eyes, dark, alert, impossible to deceive, still carried the glint of someone who had spent a lifetime negotiating, weighing risks, turning effort into fortune. Not literally, of course, but investments in American coal mines and extraction contracts across the northern continent had produced enough wealth that the distinction hardly mattered. "You're quiet," he said. He did not lift his gaze from the papers spread across his desk. Claire stood near the fireplace, arms folded, watching the flames with enough attention to pass for distraction. I'm always quiet. Quieter than usual. He finally looked up. Did something happen at Dunmore? Claire kept her expression neutral. It was a skill learned early. Her father noticed everything, and the only defense was to offer nothing to be noticed. Nothing important. Douglas studied her for a moment too long to be casual, then he returned to the papers, as though he had decided to accept the answer. For now. The solicitors will be here tomorrow at 10. They need your signature on the legal instruments, he turned a page, and the bank representatives will come on Thursday. You don't need to be present, but it would be advisable. I'll be there. Good. Silence settled between them. Comfortable in the way only silence between people who know one another deeply can be. Claire watched her father work, the way he frowned over figures, the quick notes in the margins, the way he twirled his pen when thinking, familiar gestures, etched into memory since childhood, gestures that had taught her more about business, responsibility, and power than any book ever could. There's a ball on Friday, Douglas said casually. Claire stiffened at once. No. You didn't even let me finish. I don't need to. The answer is no. He set the pen aside, leaned back in his chair, folded his arms across his chest, the posture he adopted in difficult negotiations, patient, immovable, willing to wait as long as necessary. It's at the Waverleys, he said. Important people. A calculated pause. The sort of contact that can be useful. Useful for what? For business. Another pause, shorter. For the future. For you. Something tightened in Claire's chest. I don't need contacts, Father. Everyone needs contacts. I have Dunmore. I have the businesses. I have everything I need. Douglas remained silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Lower. More careful. The tone he used rarely. Reserved for conversations that truly mattered. Claire. She did not respond. For you are 24. Intelligent. Beautiful. And possessed of a fortune larger than that of many lords who will be at that ball. He tilted his head slightly. Yet you spend your life hidden away in Scotland. Alone. In a house too large for one person. Pretending you want nothing beyond what you already have. I'm not pretending. You are. He looked at her with the same intensity he gave contracts that decided entire fates. I know you, daughter. I've known you since you fit in my arms, and I know when you're running from something. Claire looked away. The fire crackled. Outside, a carriage passed, wheels rattling over stone. Somewhere in the house, servants moved quietly, keeping the invisible machinery of the household running. I'm not asking you to find a husband, Douglas continued. I'm not asking you to dance all night, or pretend to be someone you're not. I'm asking for one evening, one appearance. Show the world that Douglas Fraser has a daughter, and that she is not a ghost. And if I don't want to, then you won't go, he shrugged. I have never forced you into anything, Claire. Never. But I am asking. As your father. As someone who cares for you. The silence that followed was heavy, full of what remained unsaid. Claire thought of Dunmore, of the locked mahogany box, of the 18 letters she would never read again. She thought of the name she avoided speaking, of the face she had never seen, of the voice she had never heard, yet imagined deep and measured, matching the firm, angular handwriting. She thought of everything she had lost, without ever truly having it. And then she thought, what are the chances he will be there? London was vast, the season long, dozens of balls, receptions, dinners. The likelihood of crossing paths with the Duke of Blackmore on a single night was minimal, almost non-existent. And even if she did, what could he do? He had dismissed her, chosen the dukedom, the obligations, the duty, chosen everything except her. If she saw him, he would be nothing more than a stranger she had never truly known. One night, Claire said at last. Douglas nodded. No triumph, no surprise, only acceptance. One night. He returned to his papers. She remained silent, watching the fire. On Friday she would attend the Waverley Ball, and whatever came after, relief, indifference, or something she did not yet have the courage to name, she would face it as she always had. Alone, with her head held high, without looking back. Chapter 11. The Ball. The Waverley Ballroom glittered like an open jewel box. Hundreds of candles trembled in crystal chandeliers, spilling golden light over silk gowns, over fortunes' worth of jewels. Over faces carefully arranged into expressions of calculated pleasure. The air was thick, with perfume, with human warmth, with conversations that revealed much, while saying nothing. The season stood at its peak, and everyone who mattered was present. Elliot hated every second of it. Leaning against one of the columns near the garden doors, he held a glass of champagne he had no intention of drinking. He surveyed the room with the expression of a man fulfilling an onerous duty. He had already danced with Lady Arabella, 2 sets, as decorum required. He had smiled at the proper moments, offered the expected remarks, and now, with the formality satisfied, he allowed himself a few moments of stillness. Before his aunt guided him to the next carefully orchestrated introduction, that was when he saw her. She had just entered through the main doors, accompanied by an older gentleman Elliot did not recognize. There was no hesitation in her step, no anxious glance, no searching for familiar faces or silent approval. She crossed the room as though it belonged to her, unhurried, unostentatious, with a quiet assurance that made everything else seem like noise. Elliot straightened without realizing it. She was not the most beautiful woman in the room. There were lovelier faces, more ornamented, more deliberately displayed, but there was something about her that caught the eye and refused to release it. Her brown hair was arranged simply, almost austerely, refusing to compete with the elaborate constructions around her. The dark blue gown was elegant without excess, a silent declaration that she had nothing to prove, and the way she inclined her head as she listened to the man beside her, attentive, respectful, never submissive. Elliot knew that gesture, he knew that restraint, and had no idea from where. He crossed the ballroom before he could reflect on what he was doing. His feet carried him as though they possessed a will of their own, weaving past small groups in conversation, ignoring greetings from acquaintances, deaf to the murmur he left behind. When he drew close enough, she lifted her eyes, light brown, almost golden beneath the candlelight. Something shifted in Elliot's chest, something old, something he could not name. "Forgive my boldness," he said. His own voice sounded strange to him. "But you seem familiar, and I cannot recall from where." It was a lie. He had never seen her before, he would have remembered. And yet the familiarity was there, inexplicable, like recognizing a melody before hearing it whole. She regarded him for a moment. There was something in her gaze, a swift, precise appraisal, as though she were deciding how much of him deserved attention. "Perhaps your Grace is mistaking me for someone else," she replied. Her voice was exactly as Elliot had imagined, clear, restrained, every word chosen with care. "Perhaps," he did not retreat, "but I don't believe so." The man beside her, her father presumably, watched the exchange with measured interest, the look of someone assessing situations, not people. Elliot ignored him. "Elliot Hawthorne," he said, inclining his head. "And you are—" "Douglas Fraser." The handshake was firm, direct. "From Edinburgh. And this is my daughter, Claire." Claire. The name struck Elliot like a shock, but it did not connect, not yet. Claire was common enough, Fraser as well, and he was too occupied with watching her, with trying to understand why his heart was pounding as though he had run a great distance, when he had been standing still all evening. "Miss Fraser," he said, bowing, "may I have the honor of this dance?" She hesitated. It was minimal, almost imperceptible. Still, Elliot noticed the slight stiffening of her shoulders, the nearly retreating step, the way her fingers closed more firmly around her fan. Then she nodded. "You may." The orchestra struck up a waltz. Elliot offered his hand. She took it, and when her fingers touched his, even through gloves, even with all the required formality, he felt as though the world had held its breath. They walked to the center of the floor, took their proper positions. The music began. "You reside in Edinburgh?" he asked, guiding the first steps. "In the Highlands, actually," she replied. "I own an estate called Dunmore." Dunmore. The word tolled through Elliot's mind like a bell. Dunmore, Highlands, Claire Fraser. No. The woman before him could not be born of letters. Women of letters did not enter ballrooms like this. "Dunmore," he repeated, his voice too tight. "In Scotland." "Yes." She met his eyes now, without flinching. "Do you know it?" Elliot stopped. In the center of the ballroom, surrounded by couples spinning around them. He simply halted. His hand at her waist went rigid, all color drained from his face. "Miss Fraser," he said. The words rose from somewhere far too deep. "Miss Claire Eliza Fraser?" She did not answer. She did not need to. The answer was in her eyes. Light brown, almost golden, exactly as he had imagined them for months, in letters kept in a locked drawer. Eyes that now regarded him, without surprise, without accusation, without anger, only with an implacable calm. More devastating than any reproach. She knew. She had known from the instant he introduced himself to her father, from the moment he asked for the dance. She had known while they waltzed, while he made trivial inquiries about Scotland, while he charmed himself with a woman he had already dismissed, with polite words on expensive paper, and she had said nothing. "Claire," he murmured. Her name sounded like an apology. Like everything he had never managed to say in the 18 letters they had exchanged. She stepped back. "It was a pleasure meeting you, Your Grace," she said. Her voice was perfect, polite, intact. "Thank you for the dance." Then she turned away, returning to her father's side. Elliot remained at the center of the ballroom, motionless, surrounded by music, by light, by voices, more alone than he had ever been in his life. Chapter 12. The Rumour. Claire returned from the ball in silence. Seated beside her father in the carriage, her gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the window, Douglas did not ask questions. He had always known how to recognize the moments when silence was the only possible form of care, and this was one of them. They parted in the corridor of the rented house with a brief nod. Claire went up to her room without looking back. She dismissed the maid who waited to help her undress. A quiet word of thanks. The door closed behind her. She leaned against it. Remained still in the dark for a length of time she could not measure. So this was how he was. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark hair falling over his forehead in a disorder too deliberate to be accidental, and his eyes, God, his eyes. A blue she had not expected, intense, attentive. Eyes that had found her in the middle of a crowded ballroom and recognized her without knowing who she was. Or perhaps he had known. Perhaps there had been something in the letters that he too had felt. That unsettled familiarity, that sense of knowing someone before meeting them, perhaps that was why he had crossed the room, why he had asked for the dance, why his voice had faltered when he finally pieced it together. Claire. The way he had spoken her name, like a prayer, like a belated plea for forgiveness. She went to the dressing table, sat before the mirror. The dark blue gown was still impeccable, her hair only slightly loosened. Nothing about her revealed the silent earthquake that had taken place inside. Good. She had always been good at that. At hiding, at pretending, at surviving. The question was whether she still wanted to be. The following days passed in a haze of obligations. Claire accompanied her father to meetings with solicitors, signed documents she scarcely read, smiled at bankers who treated her as a respectable extension of Douglas Fraser. It was a familiar role. The discreet daughter. Present and convenient, useful, without ever taking up too much space, but her mind remained elsewhere. In a candle-lit ballroom, in the restrained warmth of a hand through a glove, in the voice of a man who had spoken her name as though it were the only word that mattered. On Wednesday, Helena came to visit. Claire nearly refused, nearly asked the maid to say she was indisposed, out, anything that might spare her from speaking of what she did not wish to name. But Helena was her friend, her only true friend, and refusing her would have been a cruelty Claire did not have the strength to commit. She received her in the sitting room, with tea and biscuits that neither of them touched. "You were at the Waverley Ball," Helena said. She had not yet fully settled. "I didn't see you exactly, but I heard remarks. Someone mentioned Douglas Fraser and his daughter, and I—" "Yes," Claire said, pouring the tea with steady hands. "I was there." Helena hesitated, then drew a breath. "And you saw Elliot?" The name hovered between them, too fragile to touch. "I did." "Claire, I didn't know you would be there. If I had, I would have warned you. I would have—" "Helena," Claire raised a hand. "It's all right." "It isn't." Helena's eyes shone with restrained emotion. "He told me about the letters. Not everything, but enough. And I know that you—" She let the sentence fade. Claire lifted the cup to her lips, took a sip she did not feel. "It was months ago," she said. "It's over." "It isn't," Helena insisted, leaning forward. "You didn't see his face when he came back from the ball. I've never seen my brother like that. Never. He looked shattered." The word brought no satisfaction, no relief, only a deep weariness, accumulated from all the things that had never been said. "He made a choice," Claire replied, setting the cup down carefully. "And I made mine." Helena opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. Something shifted in her expression. "Claire, have you heard about Lady Arabella?" The name was unfamiliar. Still, the care with which Helena pronounced it made something tighten in Claire's stomach. "No. It's only a rumor," Helena hurried on. "It may mean nothing. But people are saying that he is courting Lady Arabella Ashby. She has a considerable fortune, and my aunt has been speaking of it everywhere, saying an announcement may soon be made." Claire grew very still. The clock on the mantel marked the seconds, implacable. Outside, a carriage passed. A door closed somewhere in the house. "I see," she said at last. "It may just be gossip, Claire. You know how society is. People exaggerate. Invent—" "Helena!" Claire smiled, far too politely. "It's all right." But it wasn't. Now everything made sense. The farewell letter, the obligations of the dukedom, the sentence that had haunted her for months. You deserve someone who can offer more than words on paper. He needed money. And she, who possessed more than he had ever imagined, had never said. And he, who needed it desperately, had never asked. And now he was courting another woman, a woman with a fortune, and an aunt who spread the news all over London. So this was how it ended. Helena left some time later. With apologies Claire accepted without truly hearing them. As soon as she was alone, Claire went upstairs and began to pack. She would not remain in London to witness the engagement of Elliot Hawthorne. She would not stay to hear the remarks, the congratulations, the murmurs about the Duke who had finally chosen a suitable wife. The following morning, she sought out her father in the study. "I need to return to Dunmore." Douglas looked up. "Has something happened?" "No." Her voice remained steady. "I simply need to go home." He studied her for a long moment, saw more than she would have liked. He always did. But he did not ask. "I'll have the carriage prepared." "Thank you." 2 days later, Claire left London at dawn. When the streets were still empty, when the city seemed to be holding its breath, she did not look back. She left no note for Helena. She left nothing except an empty space in the Waverley ballroom, where a woman in a dark blue gown had danced a single waltz, with a man who had let her go twice. Chapter 13. The Refusal. Elliot learned that she had left 3 days after the ball. Helena entered the study without knocking, as always. But this time there was no lightness in her step. Her face was pale, her eyes reddened, as though she had been crying. She paused in the doorway, holding an unopened envelope. "Claire has gone. The words fell into the silence of the room like something too heavy to be lifted. "What did you say?" "She's returned to Scotland." Helena crossed the room and sank into the chair opposite his desk. Her hands were trembling. "I went to see her yesterday. The maid said she left at dawn, without telling anyone." Elliot did not move. He could not. Since the ball he had thought of her without respite, of the way she had looked at him when she finally understood, without surprise, without anger, only that terrible calm, worse than any rebuke. Of the flawless composure with which she had taken her leave, of the image of her walking away, leaving him alone at the center of the ballroom. She had known from the beginning, and had chosen to say nothing. "I mentioned Lady Arabella," Helena continued quietly, "when I visited her. I told her about the talk going around." Elliot closed his eyes. "Why?" "Because she asked if I had heard anything about you." Helena swallowed. "I thought she deserved to know. Perhaps I believed the truth might change something. It was foolish. It was cruel. And now she's gone because of me. It wasn't because of you. It was." "Helena." He opened his eyes and met her gaze. "The responsibility is mine. It always has been." The silence that followed was too dense for words. Elliot thought of the letter he had written months earlier, of the measured phrases, the courteous justifications, the comfortable lie that he was acting out of honor. He thought of the 18 letters locked in his drawer, bound with a cord he sometimes touched without reason, simply to remind himself that they had existed. He thought of her crossing the Waverley ballroom, composed, restrained, beautiful in a way that demanded no ornament. And he thought of how he had let her go. Again. "What do you intend to do?" Helena asked. "What is expected of me?" He rose. "I will attend the Ashby ball tonight." Lady Arabella is waiting for an answer. Helena stared at him as though he had lost his senses. "Elliot, tell me you're not serious. It is the most sensible course." "For God's sake!" She stood as well, her hands clenched. "You have just learned that the woman you love left London because she believes you are about to marry another. And your decision is to proceed exactly as everyone expects? I did not say that I love her. You don't need to." Helena stepped closer. "I've watched you these past months. I've seen you check the post every morning, seen you lose sleep, seen you cross that ballroom as though nothing else existed when you saw her. You love her, Elliot. Anyone can see it. What I feel does not change my position. It changes everything. Not when there is a dukedom on the brink of collapse. And people who depend on me." His voice came out harder than he intended. "Do you think I can ignore debts, obligations, responsibilities I inherited? Lady Arabella brings stability. Claire Fraser cannot." Helena recoiled, as though struck. "You don't know that. I know enough. Did you ask?" The question hung between them. Elliot opened his mouth. Nothing came, because the answer was simple and cruel. No. In months of letters, he had never asked, never had the courage or the humility. He had preferred to assume, to decide alone, to choose based on appearances. "I thought as much," Helena said quietly, with a sadness that cut deeper than anger. "You dismissed her without ever truly knowing her. And now you are about to do the same to yourself." "Helena." "No." She raised a hand. "Do what you believe is right. Marry. Preserve the dukedom. But do not ask me to pretend there will be no consequences." She left the study without looking back. The door closed sharply. Elliot was alone. The clock marked the hours. The fire burned low. The afternoon light gilded the rooftops of London, the same light that would illuminate the Ashby ball in a few hours' time. Lady Arabella would be there, ready to be the sensible choice. And somewhere to the north, Claire Fraser was moving farther and farther away. "Did you ask?" The question echoed. He had not asked. He never had. And for the first time since inheriting the title, Elliot allowed himself to consider that every answer he had relied upon might be wrong. That night he went to the Ashby ball. Lady Arabella received him with a flawless smile. They danced, they conversed. Everything unfolded with the expected precision. Her mother approached soon after, attentive eyes, the posture of someone awaiting a decision. It would take a single word, a gesture, and the future would be set. Elliot opened his mouth and saw Claire. Not in truth. She was not there. But she was, in the corner of his mind, in the silence between one thought and the next. In the dark blue gown, with eyes that never accused him, her question returned whole. If I cross that line, I don't know if I can come back. And you? Your Grace, Lady Arabella's mother prompted. Elliot drew a deep breath. I beg your pardon. He bowed with impeccable correctness. But I must decline the honor you offer me. Lady Arabella deserves to be chosen without reservation. And I am not that man. The silence was absolute. He did not wait for explanations. He bowed once more and left the ballroom. With each step he felt lighter. When he reached the entrance, Helena was there. She said nothing. She simply smiled. I need a carriage, Elliot said, and a map to Dunmore. Her smile widened fully. I'll see to it at once. Elliot nodded. Within hours he would depart for Scotland. He would find Claire Fraser. He would say everything he had left unsaid, and if she refused him, at least he would know that this time he had not fled from the choice. Chapter 14, Dunmore. The journey took 5 days. 5 days of muddy roads, passable inns, and a silence Elliot did not try to break. The driver hired in Edinburgh spoke little, a blessing. Elliot had no words to offer, only thoughts circling endlessly, rehearsing confessions that never seemed sufficient. What would he say to her? I was wrong. I was a coward. I stepped away because I was afraid to want what I believed unattainable. Too weak. I love you. From the first letter in which you corrected my error about legal deadlines, true but incomplete, I refused Lady Arabella before I even knew where you lived, before I saw your home, before I had any reason to expect something in return. Better. And yet, would it be enough? Scotland received him beneath a grey sky and a cutting wind. The landscape shifted with every hour. Green hills gave way to dark mountains. Narrow rivers wound through moss-covered stone. It was an ancient, quiet land, as though each valley guarded its own memory. Elliot understood then why Claire loved it. On the 5th day, as the sun began to sink behind the mountains, the carriage turned onto a dirt road that climbed a gentle rise. The driver pointed ahead. Dunmore, my lord, just there. Elliot leaned toward the window and stopped breathing. The house he had imagined did not exist, not modest, not restrained, not small. What stood before him was something else entirely. 3 stories of grey stone, solid as the mountain behind it, tall windows catching the evening light like watchful eyes, broad gardens stretching farther than sight could follow, stables far too large for a quiet household. This was not a country house, it was an estate. The carriage passed through wrought iron gates, true gates bearing a crest. Ancient oaks lined the avenue. Servants appeared before the wheels had stopped. A liveried butler descended the steps with the practiced dignity of a man accustomed to receiving consequence. Elliot stepped down from the carriage with stiff legs and a mind in disarray. Your Grace, the butler said, bowing. Are you expected? No, Elliot answered honestly, but I should like to speak with Miss Fraser, if she is willing to receive me. The butler showed no surprise. He inclined his head. If you will wait in the hall, I shall inform her. The hall was vast. A crystal chandelier spilled light worth more than many houses Elliot had known. Ancestral portraits lined the walls. Generations of Frasers watched him in silence. Polished mahogany reflected candlelight as servants moved with quiet efficiency. Elliot stood at the center of the hall. For the first time in his life he felt small. He had been wrong. About everything. Claire Fraser was not a woman clinging to a fragile inheritance. She was something else entirely. Far beyond what his assumptions had allowed him to see. Footsteps sounded on the staircase. Elliot looked up. She descended slowly, one hand resting on the dark wooden rail. A moss-green gown followed her movements with restrained elegance. Her hair was arranged simply, Her face revealed no surprise, no anger, no expectation, only that contained calm he had learned to fear. "Your Grace," she said, "I did not expect to see you here." "I know." He drew a breath. "Forgive me for arriving unannounced, but I needed to speak with you." "You needed to?" "Yes." She reached the last step and stopped, keeping her distance. "Then speak." Every speech he had rehearsed vanished. "I was wrong," he said at last. "About everything." She waited. "The letter I wrote—" He ran a hand through his hair. "I said I was protecting you, that I was acting out of duty. But the truth is, I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Of wanting you." The words held. "The dukedom is in debt," he continued with unvarnished honesty. "I inherited a title that is bleeding dry. I convinced myself I needed a profitable match. And when I realized what I felt for you, I ran. I hid behind honor. Many people depend on Blackmore." He inhaled. "I was a coward." "And now?" she asked. "What has changed?" "I refused Lady Arabella." The first crack appeared, barely visible. "When?" "Before I came." He stopped himself from stepping closer. "I could not bear knowing you had left." Silence. "I did not come here for money, Claire. I came because I failed to forget you. If you send me away, I will accept it. But you needed to know this. If I could go back, I would have chosen you from the beginning. I choose you now, even without knowing whether you still want me." The silence stretched. Then Claire descended the remaining steps, stopping one pace away. "You came here believing I was poor?" "Yes." "Believing marrying me would cost you Blackmore?" "Yes." "And you came anyway?" "I did." She drew a steady breath. "My father is Douglas Fraser," she said quietly, "a man of considerable ventures on the American continent. My circumstances are very different from what you imagined." Elliot blinked, stunned. "I never told you," she continued, "because I needed to know whether you would choose me without it. And now," she held his gaze, "now I know." The smile that appeared was small, careful, real. Elliot lifted his hand, giving her time to retreat. She did not. "I love you," he said. "I know," she replied softly. "I do too." And at last, there was no distance left between them. Epilogue. The summer of 1847 arrived at Dunmore, carrying the scent of lavender and promises kept. Claire was in the garden when she heard the carriage. Not the visitor's carriage. She would have recognized that by the lighter sound of the wheels. This one was heavier, familiar, the family carriage. Returning from Blackmore with the husband who had spent the past week tending to the affairs of the dukedom, 1 year married. The wedding had been simple, by the standards the title allowed. Held at Dunmore on a clear July morning, before only a handful of witnesses, Helena, Douglas Fraser, a few close relations, and servants who had quietly become part of their lives. There had been no needless display, no parade of alliances, no ambition disguised as celebration, only vows spoken with the gravity of those who already understood the weight of words, and the relief of finally being able to say them aloud. London had commented, as London always did. But Dunmore had remained silent, and within that silence Claire learned what it meant to share a life without losing herself. At times it still seemed impossible. She set aside the pruning shears and walked toward the oak-lined drive, her hand resting instinctively on the gentle curve of her belly. 5 months. Before long, Dunmore would hold something it had never truly known, the cry of a child. The carriage came to a halt. The door opened. Elliot stepped down with the restrained haste of a man attempting to preserve his dignity, and failing the moment he saw her. His dark hair was disordered from the journey, his coat slightly rumpled. But his eyes, those blue eyes she had learned to recognize long before ever seeing them, softened the instant they found her. "You're covered in soil," he observed, "and you look exhausted." "Blackmore is far too large without you," Claire smiled. He came closer, ignoring the apron the housekeeper disapproved of, the servants who politely looked away, and gathered her carefully, in that new, attentive way he had learned over the past months. "The doctor would say you should be sitting," he murmured. "The doctor exaggerates." "Perhaps." His hand settled reverently over her belly. "But I do not." Claire laughed, a light, easy sound she had never known she carried before him. "I missed you," he said quietly. "It was only 20 days. Far too long." He kissed her there, beneath the ancient oaks that had witnessed generations of Frasers. Not a hurried kiss, not a desperate one, but the kind shared by those who no longer hurry, because they know they will have all the time in the world. When they parted, Claire rested her forehead against his. "How is Blackmore?" she asked. "Better." His sigh carried relief, not burden. "The largest debts are paid. The east wing no longer leaks, and the tenants seem far less inclined to flee than they did a year ago. Remarkable progress. All because of you." Claire shook her head. "The money is my father's. The management is yours." "The trust is yours," Elliot replied softly. "You gave me a chance I did not deserve. Everything that followed came because you chose to let me try again." She did not answer. She did not need to. Instead, she threaded her fingers through his and led him inside, the house that was now theirs, belonging to them as surely as the hills, the sky, and the mountain wind. He grew quiet for a moment. Then he went to the window. The very one where Claire had once stood watching snow gather, wondering whether she would ever hear from him again. "Sometimes I still think about that letter," he said, "about how I tried to sound noble when I was only afraid." "I know. And I wonder what would have happened if I had asked the right question." Claire joined him, looking out at the garden that had carried them here. "If you had asked," she said slowly, "we might never have known whether you chose me for myself, or for what I could offer. And now? Now I know." She turned to him. "You chose me, believing you would lose everything," Claire said. "You came here expecting ruin, and you came anyway." "I would come again," he replied, 1,000 times. "I know," she smiled. "That is why I am still here." Elliot drew her close. She rested her head against his shoulder, listening to the steady proof of his heart. "Claire?" "Yes?" "Thank you." "For what?" "For teaching me how to see." He did not answer further. He simply rested his hand on her belly, with the reverence of a man who finally understands what he holds. That evening, they dined together in the room that was now theirs. They laughed over an overly long letter from Helena, debated their next journey to Blackmore, and wagered on when Douglas Fraser would finally admit to liking his son-in-law. It was an ordinary life. It was everything Claire had ever wanted. Later, when the house had fallen asleep and the candles burned low, she lay awake for a moment, listening to her husband's steady breathing. In the drawer of the writing desk, 18 letters were still kept. She no longer needed to read them. She had the original now, the man who had written them sleeping beside her, choosing her every day as he had chosen her then, without knowing what she possessed, knowing only who she was. Claire closed her eyes, and for the first time in a very long while, she did not dream of letters or silences. She dreamed of summers at Dunmore, of children's laughter in the garden, of an entire life beside someone who had, at last, chosen to love. Love. Before you go, I'd love to know what this story meant to you. What stayed with you after the final page? Did Claire and Elliot's journey move you the way it moved me while telling it? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them. And your words are part of what keeps these stories alive. Thank you for listening until the end.